Picture this, it's 2020. You're a socially conscious consumer, and you want your money to actually do some good in the world, not just sit in a vault, right? So you sign up for this explosive new Fintech app called Aspiration Partners, because that's exactly what they promise. Well, welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to forensically unpack a genuinely fascinating and honestly kind of alarming story from the modern financial world. We are looking at the jarring disconnect between the utopian promises of a socially conscious company and its alleged reality. This isn't just some boring banking story. It's a deep dive into the psychology of startups, the massive pressure cooker of the tech industry, and what actually happens when the noble pursuit of doing good collides with the desperate need to keep a company afloat.
$248 million. Okay, let's just pause for a second and really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of that number. I mean, we're not talking about a minor accounting goof or a bad spreadsheet here. According to federal prosecutors, this is the staggering amount of money tied up in what they allege was an elaborate 5-year fraud scheme happening quietly right behind the scenes. Think about that for a second. For half a decade, everyday people, alongside massive institutional investors, were allegedly funneling $250 million into an entity they truly believed was changing the world. A number that big? It absolutely demands that we look closely at how a completely illusory operation could sustain itself for so long without, setting off massive alarm bells.
When the Department of Justice finally popped the hood on Aspiration Partners, they didn't just find a failing business model. No, they found what they explicitly called a jarring disconnect. They described the whole shebang as a fraud masquerading as entrepreneurship. Wow, that is a heavy accusation, right? It fundamentally flips how we look at corporate failure. So over the next few minutes, we're going to perform an autopsy on this scandal. We'll investigate how a company, built from the ground up on the widely celebrated promise of literally saving the planet, could allegedly mutate into a financial black hole, just swallowing up hundreds of millions of dollars while leaving investors and consumers totally in the dark.
So, Section 1, the ethical veneer, and how perception trumped truth. At the start, the company marketed this deeply soulful, world-saving mission. They sold you on this brilliant idea that with every single swipe of your debit card, you are actively planting a tree and fighting climate change. And honestly, it was an incredibly compelling narrative. You felt good buying your coffee, you genuinely thought you'd finally found a bank with an actual soul. But the reality? According to investigators, it was a cold, hard investor heist happening in the background. They alleged the company just became this money-extracting husk that relentlessly prioritized shareholder smiles and raising fresh capital over making any real, measurable environmental impact. In modern finance, a flawless perception is often way more powerful and, frankly, way more lucrative than the messy truth.
So what was the engine driving this pristine perception? It was ESG marketing. Now, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And around 2020, it was an absolute cultural zeitgeist. Everybody wanted their investments to reflect their personal morals. Aspiration totally recognized this green wave and masterfully leveraged nebulous buzzwords like sustainable and impact-driven. By positioning themselves as the ethical alternative to those big, gluttonous Wall Street banks, they seduced socially conscious investors who were just eager to do the right thing. It created this powerful but ultimately short-lived illusion of business ingenuity. The brilliance of it is that when you wrap your business in the unassailable armor of saving the planet, the critical voices, the financial skeptics, they just get completely drowned out by the enthusiasm.
Moving on to Section 2, the 5-year shell game, and the anatomy of an alleged fraud.
All right, so how did they actually pull this off behind closed doors? Well, investigators claim Aspiration's leadership managed this multi-year cash extraction by maintaining two completely separate realities. The internal truth? It was bleak. The fintech was operating at a massive loss, burning cash like crazy, and struggling to attract real capital. But the external narrative, the inflated facade they presented to backers, was packed with completely false metrics showing explosive growth. It was this meticulously crafted illusion that generated those crucial shareholder smiles. By basically running two different versions of the company, leadership allegedly convinced investors to just keep pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into a sinking ship, desperately plugging the holes with fresh money.
It's a fascinating and honestly pretty common psychological descent. You start with step 1, a struggling startup desperately needing cash just to survive the quarter. Instead of pivoting or admitting defeat, we hit step 2. Leadership yields to that pathological Silicon Valley temptation to fake it till you make it. Venture capital demands hockey stick growth, right? And when reality doesn't match the expectation, the pressure to artificially bridge that gap becomes overwhelming. Which leads us to step 3. To keep the lights on, they allegedly had to rely entirely on inflated figures and nebulous bookkeeping. Normal operations completely morphed into an absolute clown show of corporate oversight.
And just how bad was this lack of oversight? Well, when federal prosecutors finally dug into the internal operations, they found that foundational documentation was virtually non-existent. Actually, investigators reportedly called their record-keeping a joke. A literal joke. This instantly brings to mind the massive 1MDB scandal, where billions vanished just because there was no paper trail. When a company sacrifices basic, logical accounting just to maintain a perception, the whole structure becomes a house of cards. It's genuinely mind-boggling that an enterprise handling $250 million could operate with bookkeeping standards that honestly wouldn't pass muster at a local bake sale.
This brings us to Section 3, the enshittification of ethics and the consumer impact.
Now, you've probably experienced enshittification in your own life, even if you don't call it that. Think about your favorite ride-sharing app or a social media platform. At first, it's cheap, user-friendly, totally awesome. But over time, the algorithm shifts, fees skyrocket, ads are everywhere, and suddenly the platform is more about trapping you and taking your money than providing a good service. Well, Aspiration allegedly applied this exact toxic process to ethical banking. It morphed from what seemed like a highly beneficial tool into a closed platform explicitly designed to siphon value away from the very people it promised to empower.
So instead of effortlessly planting trees, the company allegedly trapped well-meaning consumers in a super restrictive financial ecosystem. Users trying to manage their money hit these confusing subscription traps. They face psychological dark patterns, those incredibly frustrating UI tricks designed to make it nearly impossible to downgrade your account or figure out what fees you're actually paying. But absolutely the most damning part. Beyond the terrible user experience, investigators allege they completely failed to deliver on the core environmental promises that define their entire brand. The trees just weren't being planted at the scale consumers were promised, turning the whole ethical proposition into a total mirage.
Let's zoom out to Section 4, a Fintech code red, in the macro view.
The root cause of this massive failure is a really toxic combination: the unyielding pressure to achieve hypergrowth, mixed with a complete lack of verification in these fast-moving cycles. This reveals a massive systemic vulnerability across tech and finance. When market rules start protecting size, momentum, and social clout over verifiable truth, the foundation of market democracy really starts to crumble. It stops being about who has the best, most sustainable business and just becomes a game of who can tell the best story to get the next funding round. Whether it's a tiny startup or a $250 million darling, these structural vulnerabilities are dangerously present across the board.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought to really chew on. Is the ethical business model fundamentally flawed and dead on arrival? Or is this just one spectacularly bad actor in a clown show of unmitigated oversight disasters? In an era where a flawless digital perception, slick marketing, and the right buzzwords can so easily hide the financial truth, it is a crucial question. We absolutely have to demand more transparency before we let the next ethical magic trick bamboozle us into handing over our cash. Keep asking those tough questions, demand verification over feel-good narratives, and hey, thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.